we're going to go ahead and start with here.
Gary is started.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm trying to get you up here by midnight.
After 15 years.
If you're here at midnight, you're going to be very welcome. We are blessed to have a guest speaker, Tom Greminger, born and raised in St. Genevieve, now resides in Bloomsdale with his wife, Bernadette. They have 3 children, Michelle, Suzette, and Mark, 12 grandkids, and 3 great-grandkids. After graduating from Valley High School, Tom attended Southeast Missouri State University with a double major in industrial technical education and research biology. He received his master's degree in school administration from the University of Missouri in 1970 and in 1986, a special degree in school administration from Southeast Missouri State. He began his work career in the Melville School District in 1968. In 1972, he went full-time with Built Best Corporation as their industrial and public relations manager, and later became the director of marketing. In 1982, he returned to education with the St. Genevieve R2 School District as a high school principal. He moved to assistant superintendent of schools after 1 year and was lured back to Built Best as vice president of marketing and sales. After 45 years, he left Built Best and went to work for St. John County Memorial Hospital with the marketing department, where he remained until his retirement in 2018. In some capacity, Tom was either a board member, or board officer of many organizations such as St. Genevieve R2 School Board, St. Genevieve Chamber of Commerce, St. Genevieve IDC. For more than 28 years, Workforce Development Board, Wholesome Citizens Advisory Committee, Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, and the St. Genevieve Industries Board of Directors. In his spare time, Tom enjoys many things like genealogy, Civil War memorabilia, and archaeology, to name a few. Welcome, Tom Greminger.
Yeah, I am that old. And it's a lot of times when I do school presentations, the kids are always asking me, well, what did you do during the Civil War? And I'm old, but not that old. But thank you all for coming, and I want to voice my appreciation of the Dewdrop Inn at Bloomsdale and the Cozy Kitchen. They're sponsoring this event this evening, so thanks for that. I'll try not to bore you too much. There is so much to talk about. You know, even though there was no major battles, no shooting or anything that went on in St. Genevieve, there was so much that went on during the Civil War in St. Genevieve County. And I got to read my notes here because I can't remember all these figures that I'm going to, and some of them, I don't know how to put this, some of you may be offended by what you're going to hear tonight. Some of you may be thinking I'm not really being politically correct in what I say tonight, but let me tell you, during the Civil War in St. Genevieve County, if you think the Democrats and the Republicans are fighting with each other now in Washington and stuff, back during the Civil War, it was 100 times worse in St. Genevieve County, to the point of where they were actually Republicans were taking Democrats out, and Democrats were taking Republicans out and hanging them and shooting them. So I'm a big believer in that history repeats itself. And if you really think about some of the things I'm going to tell you this evening about what went on in St. Genevieve County, you'll see what I'm talking about. Of course, the big thing, during the Civil War, from a political standpoint, everybody thinks it was strictly over the slavery issue, which that was the big states' right thing that was really involved during the Civil War. But there was several other issues on states' rights that are still coming back today and prevalent in today's government happenings. And just a few examples of what I'm talking about by states' rights. And that's what the Civil War was all about. And of course, the biggest states' rights was slavery. But there was a lot of other things that the South didn't agree with the North over, and it all had to do with states' rights. And some of the ones that, as I said, history repeats itself. If you think about today, such things as the abortion issue, that was unheard of. Interracial marriages, which I think just today, didn't I hear where Congress just passed today where same-sex marriage was approved by Congress? That, needless to say, was definitely not allowed back in 1861 or during the Civil War. And on a local thing, as far as some of the taxing issues that went on between things that the Northern government, Lincoln's government at that time, was imposing on the South, and it had to do with taxes and import duties and stuff on cotton and tobacco coming north and revenues and so forth. But there's just, if you really think about states' rights that are just now coming back in focus, history repeating itself, things like the big issue that right now a lot of states are having over the way you vote. And that's all controlled by the states. Is, the state voting laws as far as how that's set up. That's a state's rights. Things like insurance. I don't know if you all realize, but your medical insurance and your life insurance and everything, that's not a federal thing. That's a state. All your insurances is governed by the state. And all of your things having to do with like marriage laws and so forth like that, like I said, same-sex marriages, interracial marriages and so forth, that all goes back to states' rights that were given back well before the Civil War, and now they're all coming back to haunt us. But anyway, just a few things about St. Genevieve.
Tom, was it different in other places, worse here than other places around in
Yeah,
the States?
I think it was. When I actually tell you that the fact that Missouri was a border state, and what you're going to hear tonight is all of the split right here in St. Genevieve County on a small town level. And let me just give you a few figures, and I got to read these because I can never remember all these figures. The U.S. Census was taken every 10 years, just like it is now. Okay, so the figures that I'm going to read you about St. Genevieve County is from the 1860 census, which was a year before the Civil War started. So they're going to be pretty accurate as far as the first, another one of the things that as it has to do with states' rights was in 1861, the first income tax by the U.S. government was a 3% on all income over $800. And that income tax, from a federal standpoint, was put on states as a federal function to pay for the Civil War, to pay for the Union Army. And just to give you, some idea on the taxes, things that were taxed. And taxes were a national revenue thing to where just about every facet of daily life you had to pay a tax on. And such things as, and I'm just going to go down this list and read some of these things, and the revenue stamp that you had to get when you paid these taxes, on this one sheet here are some of the very colorful and very artistic revenue stamps. And revenue stamps on such things as playing cards, passage tickets, telegraphs, when you send a telegram, express, bills of lading, power of attorney, foreign exchange, insurance, leases, mortgages, security bonds, probate of wills. Any of those things is just a small list of some of the revenue taxes that you had to pay. Now, what am I talking about by revenue taxes? Well, some of you in here, I think, are old enough to remember when on the top of a whiskey bottle, you used to have a revenue stamp that was sealed over the top of the whiskey bottle, or a pack of cigarettes. On the bottom of the pack of cigarettes was that little blue stamp, or those were revenue stamps. The best one that I can think of that is still in existence today, that is a federal revenue stamp, and some of you hunters, is a duck stamp. That's considered a true revenue stamp, is the federal duck stamp. And of course now you also have the state of Missouri as a duck stamp. But everything was taxed. And after the Civil War, it even went on to things that were taxed, such as butter and potatoes by the pound. You actually had revenue stamps that was for potatoes and stuff. So you were taxed big time. If you think your taxes are bad now, back then, and when I tell you about the value of a dollar or the value of a penny, what it was now, I mean, now you see them laying in the parking lot and stuff, and you won't even pick them up, But it's when you look at the value back then and the value now on coinage and greenback, paper money, you got to remember that at the start of the Civil War, there was no such things as dollar bills or paper money. You either had bank drafts, which was basically issued by banks, and the best way I can describe what those were was like if you go in now and get a cashier's check, that's what the bank drafts were. And they were printed, the states had bank drafts, and also local city banks, the bigger banks. And some of them are over here on the table here, and you can see the Missouri state, what looks like paper money or dollar bills, are Confederate money, as some of you see all the Confederate money that was printed. There are bank drafts over here on the table, examples of them. But the bank drafts was issued along with, at that time, the exchange rate was all in coinage. And it was either copper pennies, or it was everything else in your change was silver. It was actually silver. And up until 1964, actually, all your dimes and quarters and half dollars were silver. And it went into your gold pieces. And your gold pieces at that time were, you had a $5, a $20, and a $50 gold piece is what the actual coinage was. Well, when the Civil War started, and talk about inflation, and I've got these figures somewhere, but I want to say that where is it here? The rate of inflation for the northern states, okay, was 80%. 80%. And we're talking now, what, 8% rate of inflation? During the Civil War, the rate of inflation was 80%. For the northern states, the rate of inflation for the southern states during the Civil War was 9,000% inflation rate in the South. And of course, that's why all the Confederate money was just in the North and everything. It was a $5 Confederate bill was worth 2 cents in the North. It was not worth the paper it was printed on, really, is what it really boiled down to. Here's some statistics in Missouri. Missouri border state. 1,063,000 people in the state of Missouri. Okay? 1,063,000 was the population, 1860 census. Out of that, 115,000 of that were slaves. Okay? That ain't what's really going to get you. Only 38 people in the state of Missouri own more than 50 slaves. 38 people in the state of Missouri own more than 50 slaves. Only 1 in 8 families owned a slave. Okay? And the average number of slaves that family, 1 in 8 families, the average number of slaves that they would own would be 4.1 slaves. I mean, this is when we're dealing with statistics. 4.1 slaves in 1 in 8 families in the state of Missouri. the Deep South, during the Civil War, half of the population owned slaves. And the average owner in the South, the average family owner in the South of slaves was 12.7 slaves per family. And that was over half of the families in the South owned 12.7 slaves. Of course, the Missouri Compromise, 1821, all of you remember your high school civics, or maybe it was even grade school civics. Well, the Missouri Compromise, basically what that was is back then the president actually agreed to let Missouri continue being a slave state because they allowed Maine in at the same time as a state. And Maine would be a non-slave state, but they allowed Missouri to be a slave state yet in order to keep them in the Union, because it was split, at that time. So 1821 is the Missouri Compromise, which that comes back to haunt all Missourians forever, even today. Remember that the Confederate battle flag, which you all, has been banned and everything now, one of those 13 stars on that Confederate flag, the 12th one that was added on that flag was for the state of Missouri. So the Confederate states claimed Missouri as a Confederate state. On the other hand, on the U.S. flag at the same time, which had 34 stars on it, one of those stars on the U.S. flag, stars and stripes thing, one of those stars was in the Union. So the flags during the Civil War, both the Confederate capital and the Confederate government and the Union government both claimed Missouri as a state that belonged to them. Let's see. There were more than 1,100 battles. 1,100 battles and skirmishes that was fought in the state of Missouri. Now, some of them were just half a dozen guys that maybe shot at each other. Nobody was killed or anything. But there was over 1,100 battles and skirmishes that actually were reported for the state of Missouri. There was only two other states, Virginia and Tennessee, which surprised me. Only Virginia and Tennessee had more battles or skirmishes than what took place in the state of Missouri. So that's kind of interesting on all the little skirmishes. And you would kind of think about that since Missouri was a border state, that, yeah, okay, well, that kind of makes sense. Most of those battles and skirmishes in Missouri, of the 1,156, I think it was, most of them were in the very beginning of the Civil War. And they were fought to keep Missouri as a northern or a Union state. So that's kind of interesting. Now, getting it down, we're going from state now we're going to come down to St. Genevieve County. And this is where some of you may be very surprised. Of course, St. Genevieve County, on the 1860 census, this really surprised me, that there was this many people in St. Genevieve County. There was 8,029 people in St. Genevieve County in the 1860 census.
More than there is now.
No, there's like 18,000 in the county, but this was in the whole county. But that's still, when you consider what it actually tells you is St. Genevieve County hasn't grown that much, in 160 years. When you do the math on that, that's not a very big rate of growth or of population. Now, here we go. And here again, this is St. Genevieve County I'm giving you. 8,029 people in St. Genevieve County. There were 89 freed slaves in that total. There were 617 slaves. Okay? And that, if you add that, the total number of adult males in St. Genevieve County ended up being actually, and by adult males during the Civil War, or during the Civil War year, an adult male was figured on anybody between the ages of 21 and 70. Those adult males were all subject to the draft during the Civil War. So somebody that was 70 years old could still be drafted for service during the Civil War. And you do have some military records where you get, soldiers that were 60, 65, they were getting up there in age. But
you better get him a horse.
In St. Genevieve County, here again, there were, if you took 70% of the adult males from those figures, and I've got the population of the census papers to where you can figure out that St. Genevieve County actually had 1,100 round figures that were considered adult males, okay, during the Civil War. Remember that figure that I was giving you, 617 slaves. Now, one of the big things that they give in the census that you could never get away with today, and would really get into some, was if you looked at one of the actual census sheets that was kept, I guess in the courthouse. Yeah, that's where these came from. On how they were actually classified. They were classified by age, which I guess your census actually does now. Your 10-year census actually does it by state. But they were actually classified as whites, freed colored. I'm actually reading across the top column. Freed colored, and under that you would have that under freed colored, they were actually classified as either being black or mulatto. Now, mulatto by the government was classified as where you had one black parent and one white parent. Okay? And in St. Genevieve County, just to give you some figures to work with, there was 30 males and 23 females that were actually classified as mulatto. I don't think that you would find that too many of those would have been white mothers, that these mulattoes that would have been counted, that they would have had white mothers, if you get my drift of what I'm talking about here. But anyway, if you keep going across and then you get over to the slaves, like I said, then it breaks them down either as a black slave or a mulatto slave. So there were both in St. Genevieve County, and to the tune of 617 slaves. Now, if you work that out and you consider in St. Genevieve County the slave population, it's a lot of slaves in St. Genevieve County. Surprising enough, and of course, St. Genevieve County made up of the French heritage, and of course, any of your French names and French heritage in St. Genevieve County would have been Southern sympathizers. Your German migration of the 1840s that come to St. Genevieve County, all your Germans were all Union. They were definitely Northern troops. Of course, my grandpa, And the list that our group has compiled, and by the way, I'll throw in a plug right now for our group. My recruiting officer is sitting back here in the back, Bob Mueller, and he's got some paperwork if you're interested in joining our group. One of the qualifications of our group is Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, which we are the direct descendants of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, which is the veterans group of soldiers of the Civil War. Just like today you have the Vets and the American Legion as the veterans group of First World War, Second World War, and so forth. The GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, was the veterans group of the Civil War. And as I said, one of the qualifications of being in our organization, Sons of Union Veterans, you had to have a blood relation that fought in the Union Army during the Civil War. And in my case, my great-grandpa was on that list. We've compiled one of our things that we do in our group.
Our group also has people in it called associate members, where you don't have to have direct
You
lead.
don't have to have direct
So we
descent.
invite anyone that's interested in the
Civil
Civil
War.
War. Unfortunately, you have to be a male at the present time. There are ladies.
So far.
No, there's ladies organizations.
We haven't, our organization hasn't been jumped yet by the people. Someday we will have women, I'm sure. But we do have a women's auxiliary group. This list up here is, we have compiled a list of about 900 soldiers from St. Genevieve County, that about 800 of them are Union veterans, okay? And about 120 of them are Confederate veterans. The Union veterans, the records and the war records and stuff are fairly easy to get hold of. War Department, local records and stuff, where your Southern records, a lot of them were burnt in Richmond, and the states didn't keep that, they were destroyed. So a lot of their records and stuff is not available. We're Union soldiers, and our list that we've compiled, if you've got a name, if your family was around here in the 1860s, and you know a name of your great-grandpa or your great-great-grandpa, there's a 70% chance that he was a soldier, either for the South or for the North. And we can actually tell you what he did during the Civil War, what battles he was in, where he was stationed, where he was mustered in, mustered out, what he looked like. We can get his muster in papers, and he was, 5'8" and had blue eyes and blonde hair, weighed 150 pounds, soaking wet, and we can pretty well tell you about your ancestor, anything that takes place in the Civil War. So take a look at this list. If you're from St. Gen and you got relatives or know, we can pretty well fill you in on what your ancestors did during the Civil War.
I got a question, Tom. My great-great-grandpa was in Company K, I think it was.
Yep.
Was it Brad?
47th Missouri
There
Infantry.
many in that group?
There was 100 of them that was in the 47th Missouri Infantry. And the reason why I know this is that's what my great-grandpa was in the 47th. Company K of the 47th. And that was a company, 100 soldiers, 100 Union soldiers. That Company K all enlisted for 6 months. And in 1846, they enlisted for a 6-month stint. So they just got in on the very end of the Civil War.
Did they see any action then or not?
The 47th Missouri Infantry was the group that was in the Battle of Pilot Knob. Okay? The 47th was the ones that was in the fort, and they eventually retreated back up through Cuba and Leesburg and so forth. That was the 47th. The thing about Company K was made up of individuals from Perry and St. Genevieve County. 2 weeks before the Battle of Pilot Knob, where Marmaduke was coming up, they thought he was coming up the Mississippi River. They sent Company K of the 47th, they sent those boys back to St. Genevieve County. So they weren't in the Battle of Pilot Knob. They sent the guys from Perry County back to Perry County, and the guys from St. Gen back to St. Gen County to guard roads and telegraph lines and so forth at that time. They ended up 2 days before the Battle of Pilot Knob. Marmaduke was reported in Sykeston and coming up through southeast Missouri with 1,500 troops, I think it was, and there was less than 100 of these. So Company K and the Union forces all boarded a barge and went to Illinois. Didn't come back to Missouri. The Battle of Pilot Knob was the 26th and 27th of September, 1864. They didn't come back to Missouri side of the river until October the 3rd. They finally come back. But they just figured, hey, we're going to be overrun or taken prisoner. We're going to go to Illinois. And this was Price's raid of 1864 when they were coming back north to take St. Louis and Jeff City, but didn't work out because of Pilot Knob and some of the other things. But Yeah, it's out of the 800 names of Union on here from St. Genevieve County, about 75% of them were in the 78th Enrolled Missouri Militia, the EML. And the best way that I can describe that is these were all German farmers, and they didn't want to shoot people. All they wanted to do is farm. Leave me alone. You know, they're not political. Like I said, about 70% of the names on that board were in the 78. The best way I can describe what the EMM was is it's just like today's National Guard unit. They were issued guns and leathers. They were not issued uniforms, from what we can tell. They would report for drills on weekends around the courthouse square over here, but during the week they'd be back on their forms. But they were considered regular Army, and they did draw pensions, the U.S. pensions at the end of the war, which started out, it was Union soldiers' pensions was $8 a month, is what a Union soldier's pension from the Civil War was. Anyway, that was the 47th. And we'll talk about them a little bit later because they're involved in one of the families I'm going to talk about. But keep in mind some of the attitudes and so forth of what went on in St. Genevieve County. Here's an interesting thing that I found in the census figures again, 1860 census, as far as what did people do? You know, what did they do? Well, needless to say, over half of the people in St. Genevieve County were farmers. Okay? And here's the 12 occupations that had the most numbers in St. Genevieve County following farmers. As I said, farmers were over 50% of the population of that 8,000 people were considered farmers. Followed by laborers, okay, laborers, carpenters, clerks, blacksmiths, merchants, teachers, shoemakers, physicians, seamstress, teamsters, which were wagon drivers, teamsters, and tailors. That was the 12 most popular occupations. That's what people did back then. And if you think about it, out of that list, okay, and I know this for a fact, the 10 largest employers or occupations today in St. Genevieve County, none of them existed. None of them were on that list, if you think about it. Other than farmers. You know, and of course today, I don't think farmers in St. Genevieve County would make the top 10 as far as occupations. And of course, you got, you know, Limekiln and La Hoist and Tar Rock and surprisingly, the second largest employer in St. Genevieve County right now, what is it?
Hospital.
It's what?
Hospital.
Yeah, it's a hospital. What's the third largest employer in St. Genevieve County?
St. Genevieve School District.
St. Genevieve School District. Yeah. But, like I said, none of those, back during the Civil War, none of those occupations existed. Farm equipment. And since all the guys were off to war, you know, 70% of the adult males were soldiers. So what happens on the home front? Well, I'll tell you what happens. Now you start having women that instead of just doing household chores and having kids, which the actual rate of births actually dropped in St. Genevieve County during the Civil War, which you would imagine. You know, guys are gone. And morality was a little bit different back then. But farm equipment, there was this great surge of development of farm equipment. During the Civil War, they developed such things as the automatic, what do you call them,
5 years, 5 years.
The cutters, it actually would cut,
Thresher.
well, were they considered, that would actually cut the wheat. Right, not rakes, but
Mowers.
mowers. The mowers and threshers and stuff like that were all developed during the first years of the Civil War. And actually a lot of women would actually plow and get involved in the farming, since over half of them were farmers. I mean, this was their way of life. And the guys were off shooting at each other in some other state, or, well, not in the case of the 78th. They were still around. They just, on weekends, they were marching around the courthouse over here. During the Civil War, the state of Missouri, right away, by General Fremont, who was in charge of all of the military operations west of the Mississippi, he immediately declared the state of Missouri under martial law. Now, martial law in the state of Missouri, I mean, back then, what that actually boils down to is they would name what they call a provost marshal. In St. Genevieve, the provost marshal was a guy by the name of Gustav St. Jim. Okay? And we're going to talk about his family here in a little while. But Gustav St. Jim was the local provost marshal, the most hated man in St. Genevieve County. The provost marshal took the place of the local police, the local sheriff, the local judges, the jury. Everything was under their command, and it was military. You know, if you got arrested for something, you were like, not court-martialed, but you come before a military court of officers. And if they'd say, yeah, he was stealing food, take him out and shoot him. That was the way it was. That was the power that the provost marshal, or when you're under martial law. Okay? And some of the things that happened in St. Genevieve County, probably one of the most important things that happened in St. Genevieve is back then there wasn't a Herald or a Fair Play newspaper. It was called the Plain Dealer, was the name of the local newspaper. Plain Dealer. Okay? Immediately, Gustav St. Jim said, there's too many sedition people in St. Genevieve County that we're not going to allow the paper to be printed in St. Genevieve County. If you wanted St. Genevieve County or Southeast Missouri News, you got the Perryville paper. But no paper for 4 years in St. Genevieve County. You won't find any copies of it out in the library or anything of anything that happened in the local newspaper. If you had some news that was coming from Jefferson County or Perry County. And of course, this was Gustav. You got to remember Gustav and his brother, Lieutenant Colonel Felix St. James. Now, that's a little confusing when you see Gustav St. Jim, G-E-M, and his brother. Actually, at the beginning of the Civil War, he was a lawyer here in town. He was 32 or 33 years old. He was a lawyer and a very prominent citizen here in St. Genevieve. And talk about being nuts for the Union. These two guys, St. Felix actually changed his name from St. Jim to St. James. And the theory is that he changed his name because he felt that the St. Jim was too French and too Southern. And you got to remember, these guys were Northern fanatics. They were Union fanatics, believe me, some of the things that they did. So Felix, he was the first guy to enlist in St. Genevieve County. And he's our namesake. Our camp is the Lieutenant Colonel Felix St. James, Camp 326. Okay, we named it after St. James because he was the highest ranking officer from St. Genevieve County to be killed during the Civil War. He was killed at the Battle of Shiloh. Okay, and that's why both our group and the local VFW or Legion, one or the other, is also the Felix St. James Post, isn't it? Isn't one of the two?
No, Legion is the Buckholes, Kiefer.
Okay.
Kiefer Buckholes. I don't know about the VFW, I'm just talking.
See, I was thinking that one or the other was also named, after Felix St. James, and of course, when our group was formed back in 2009, we actually took that as our camp name too. But anyway, that's a side thing. We're going to talk a little bit about those families later on. As I said, the plain dealer was not allowed to be published during the Civil War. And I'm going to ask if you would to hand these out, because this is kind of interesting. If you will, hand these out. This is a list that back in, I think it was in 1864, that Gustav was asked by his Provost Marshal General in St. Louis to furnish him with the name of prominent citizens in St. Genevieve County and how their political attitudes, how they were felt. Okay? So this is actually, and I've actually got a copy of his original handwriting and stuff, but this was an actual list of what he sent to the Provost Marshal General in St. Louis about the prominent citizens in St. Genevieve County. Now, if you go down the list, it kind of reads like today's phone book in St. Genevieve. And you notice all the Rosiers and the Valleys and so forth. If you go down the list, and I've done this, out of the approximately 40-something names that's on that list, there's only 6 of them. Only 6 of them that the Provost Marshal felt was Union sympathizers. The rest of those prominent citizens at the time, he felt that they were all Southern Confederate sympathizers. And you can see his comments after each of those names. He not only called them, Union or Confederate, but he also would add a little sentence about, well, this man has a son that's in the Confederate Army. Is I forget which name's on there, but you'll notice, especially the bankers and the money men at that time that's on that list, the people that today we would consider these are the people in power in St. James County, you'll notice that they're all Southern sympathizers. But this was the list. This is what people of the time were living with. You had to watch what you were saying because you didn't know, if that word would get back to the Provost Marshal. And in some cases, there were people that were actually arrested for voicing opinions and speaking out against the Union forces that were in town. In fact, later on, I think I'll talk about it a little later, where the Provost Marshal actually called on his people to send Union forces down to live in St. James County, which it was. It was an outfit out of Illinois, one of the rifle regiments out of Illinois that actually occupied the courthouse and took the courthouse over. They lived in the courthouse, in the courtroom that's there now. Of course, the courthouse didn't look like it does now, but it was just the front half of that whole complex that's over there was the courthouse. It was there during the Civil War, but it was occupied by Union infantry that were under the command of the Provost Marshal. If he felt somebody was speaking out against the Union, he'd send troops out after him. And of course, there's a lot of bushwhackers that was coming into St. John County. Some of you might be familiar with a name by the name of Sam Hillebrand, who was a Missouri bushwhacker and murderer and thief, and he had all kinds of bad names. But he terrorized St. James County. In fact, my great-great-grandpa's farm, which is right out at where Highway O comes over and hits 61, the caves there and so forth, they actually attacked his farm and took his horses and cattle and they lived in the caves that were there on the property, which you can see from Highway 61 if you really look now that the leaves are off the trees. But Gustav sent out a detachment from here in St. John of those Illinois troops to see if they could capture those bushwhackers or rebels that were raiding St. John County. And they were actually not only raiding for food and supplies, but they were actually conscripting people. There's reports out in Pujol, and Pujol is today's Lawrencetown. It used to be Pujol. And there was a report there of where Hildebrandt and some of his men actually come in and actually said, hey, to farmers, locals, you either join us or we're going to shoot you. So they would join only to form a local company in the northern end of the county, and a month later they would all throw down the weapons and go back to farming. But a lot of that went on in St. Genevieve County, that you were being hit from both sides, both Union, that was the law, and the Confederate bushwhackers and raiders that were also in St. Genevieve County.
Hey, Tom, what does it mean on there, rebel sympathizers placed under oath or under oath?
One of the things that the provost marshal would do, and I have a copy of one of the oaths of allegiance, they would actually require, if they were considered a Southern sympathizer, the provost marshal would actually say to them, I'm going to require you to take this oath and sign your name, and in a lot of cases even post a bond, to where they would have to post their property, okay, as a bond, because there wasn't any cash to speak of. Post a bond saying that if you broke that oath, and for any reason we found that you actually aided the Confederate troops that were wandering around here, we'd actually take your farm. Or we'd send you to prison for breaking your oath. And there was several instances of St. Genevieve County men that were actually sent to Garrotte Prison, which is in St. Louis and South St. Louis, close to where the brewery is now. Wasn't it down in the Garrotte Prison? No. That was the St. Louis Arsenal. That was down near the Arsenal. I'm not really, where was Garrotte, Bob?
I don't know.
Yeah. But it was where all your provost marshals and your civil prisoners were sent during the Civil War.
There's one in Alton. I think the building's still standing. It's along the river.
That's Alton Prison. But this was named Garrotte Prison in somewhere in downtown St. Louis. But I don't remember just exactly where it was. I was thinking it was in South St. Louis somewhere.
Who appointed the provost, or how did he get appointed?
He was actually appointed by, it was political. Surprise.
Yeah.
It was a political thing. Just like Lieutenant Colonel Felix St. James, which we're going to talk about now, and maybe that will explain some of what I'm talking about here.
Tom, it was on the corner of 8th and Gratiot Street. That's what it was called.
That's where it's at today, yeah. Corner of 8th and Gratiot. Of course, the street was named after the prison. That's still.
It was named after a guy named Gratiot.
Was it?
Yeah.
Okay. There you go. See, that's why Bob's our historian. Local personalities that I've picked on two families, okay? The Chadwells, which was strong Southern, and the St. Jim or St. James family. Okay, one being very strong Union, and the other one being very strong, I guess you could say strong Southern Confederate troops. And that's what I'm going to talk about. St. James, and I told you about the name change, he closed his law practice in 1861 to recruit men, and he was very outspoken, held a lot of rallies. He was a duelist. He shot people when they didn't agree with him. He'd get them in duels back then. He was I think I read somewhere he was like 32 or 33 years old, and he was the highest ranking Union officer that was killed during the Civil War from St. James County. And that's why we all use his name and so forth. And his brother, Gustav St. Jim, was appointed provost marshal. Now, immediately when St. James, Lieutenant Colonel St. James, when he enlisted, through political, and there's a lot of controversy about how was he made a lieutenant colonel as soon as he enlisted. He was not a West Point guy, knew nothing about military, as far as drilling troops or training troops, but immediately he was made a lieutenant colonel. I think his first detachment was an Illinois regiment, I believe. Right, Bob? Or was he in the 13th Missouri?
Well, the 13th Missouri, he was in the sharpshooters group at the very beginning of the war.
Okay.
And then he went into the 13th Missouri, which became the 22nd Ohio.
Yeah, it's confusing as hell how they kept changing the names of these military units. But anyway, he was given, a lieutenant colonel's command immediately. And I suspect that Gustav ended up with his appointment the same way, because the word got back to Jeff City and back to Fremont, St. Louis, and maybe all the way to Washington, that these St. Jim or St. James, that family, were the most active Unionist people in St. James County. So we're going to make them provost marshal, and we're going to give them rank in the army and the whole bit. He was and as I said before, he was killed at the Battle of Shiloh in 1862, and he's buried, we think, he's buried next to his dad in the old cemetery.
So they did bring him back.
They did bring him back. I think they originally buried him in...
No, they brought him back.
They never buried him.
They brought him back on a train, because he was buried, he died on the 2nd, I think, and he was buried on the 14th here.
Back here in St. Genevieve County. But so, as I said, the provost marshal, I don't want to get in, we'd be here all night if I got into some of the instances that was brought up about happenings, family, personal happenings during the Civil War, and most of them involved Gustav, or the people in power. As I said, the provost marshal was judge, jury. I mean, it was it. And you really had to watch every word. Every action that you did during the Civil War you were under suspect, because you never knew when you were going to be in a bar with some Confederate sympathizers, or if there was Union sympathizers there, or what would happen, in the meantime. The other family was a strong Southern family, which was kind of weird too, was the Chadwells. Gideon Chadwell, and you all know, I think you all know where Jack Dunsey lives? On Chadwell Lane, okay? Well, that big house where Jack Dunsey lives is where Gideon Chadwell raised young Alexander. And Alexander was very well educated, and I'll tell you about the Chadwell letters later, but he was very well educated, and at the beginning, even before the war started, he was in the Missouri Guard, which was a local, like, I guess you could say, National Guard unit for the state of Missouri at the beginning of the Civil War. And the governor, Claiborne, I think, wanted to keep Missouri wanted to go south, and the Missouri militia, he was in that. At age 21, and this is what he looked like. This is young Alexander. He got into the army at age 21, and as I said, was very well educated. I ended up with the Chadwell letters, which a book was written on, and his letters home, which I've got, and that's what the book's about. Bob Schmidt, who was one of our group here in St. John, I think Bob is either on his 13th or 14th book that he's written on Southeast Missouri, Civil War in Southeast Missouri. As far as I'm concerned, he's probably the foremost authority on Civil War in Southeast Missouri of anybody around. He lives in French Village. And this was one of the books that he wrote on the Confederate cavalry group from St. Genevieve County, which a lot of them, 23 of them at least, I know for sure, are on that list up there. And the name of the book is The Boys of the Best Families in the State, Company E, 2nd Missouri Cavalry. They went on to be the headquarter or the command headquarter group. They were cavalry of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Now, any of you that studied Civil War knows that Forrest, other than Jeb Stuart, Forrest was probably the most famous cavalry officer of the Confederacy other than Jeb Stuart. I mean, he was just all over the place. And our boys from St. John County was his headquarters, or his, I guess you could say, the flag bearer group for Forrest during the Civil War. Young Chadwell eventually ends up being, since he was well educated and could write beautifully, and his letters and punctuation and grammar was perfect, he ended up being one of Forrest's adjutants that wrote orders and stuff out for Forrest. And the other one, like second command of Forrest, was Ben McCullough out of Texas. And they all during the Civil War, they were all through the Mid-South as far as in some of the major battles, Shiloh, Vicksburg, the boys from St. John, and I have young Chadwell's diary, and on page 364 is an account of Forrest when he was and any of you that know about the Fort Pillow massacre, that was the boys from St. John County that was in on that with Forrest's group. And what history recorded, and you read about what young Chadwell says about the Fort Pillow massacre, which become a battle cry. It was like, remember the Alamo? Well, remember Fort Pillow was the battle cry of Northern generals against Nathan Forrest. And it all boiled down to black troops that were in Fort Pillow. They eventually surrendered. That was what the northern newspapers want you to believe, that they surrendered and that Forrest took all 400 of the black troops that were captured, lined them up against the wall and shot them all. Fort Pillow massacre. Didn't happen that way. If you read the real statistics of what happened is the black troops knew it was Forrest, and Forrest hated the blacks and stuff. A little bit about Forrest is after the Civil War, Forrest, they wanted to try him for war crimes, just like the Nuremberg trials. They wanted to try him for war crimes. Not only did the federal government get that not done, but he was elected the Attorney General of the state of Mississippi. And later on, General Forrest becomes the first Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. So does that give you some idea of what Forrest was like? But that didn't happen. The Fort Pillow massacre, the true thing, and young Chadwell in his diary says that the black troops, the white troops that were in the fort, laid down their arms under white flag. They were captured, but the black troops, knowing it was Forrest and how Forrest hated the blacks, they all kept on firing. And Forrest gave the order, as long as they keep firing at us, you keep firing at them. And they did. And eventually, most of the blacks were killed that was in that fort. And it was about 400 blacks that were basically artillery in that fort that was right on the Mississippi River. Anyway, it's a whole other story. The guys from St. John here, and like I said, through some of Chadwell's letters home to his dad, Gideon, and his 3 sisters, a lot of those guys couldn't read or write. So he would act as a go-between between the soldier that was out in the field and the families back home. And it's an interesting story, which I won't tell you today, of how they actually got mail back and forth. But the sisters, or Gideon, they would actually transfer the news about the sons that was with young Chadwell in that company back and forth. And it was the really, really odd thing about the Chadwells was Gideon, the dad to Alexander. He was a merchant. He dealt in lumber and in cotton, okay, and tobacco. And all during the Civil War, there's reports, and we've got passage tickets and stuff, where he would go back and forth across Union Confederate lines to New Orleans. And he would get lumber and cotton and stuff brought up the Mississippi River and would trade with both sides. And I guess that's probably what kept him in business. That's what kept him alive, is he was also supplying the Union troops with food and cotton and tobacco, as well as he was also supporting the secessionists in St. Genevieve County with groceries. And I don't want to get into that, but I've got prices on some of the groceries and stuff back then. What the prices was just it would stagger your mind if you. Well, let me just read you a few. Somewhere here I've got a price list. Okay, apples, 75 cents per bushel. Okay, apples. Eggs, 10 cents a dozen is what eggs were going for. And this is in the grocery store. When you go, this is what people were paying for stuff back then. Flour was $2.50 per hundredweight, or per barrel. $2.50 for 100 pounds of flour. Okay? Oats, 30 cents per bushel. Rye, wheat, 50 cents to 60 cents per bushel. And it just goes on and on. Coffee, 33 cents per pound of coffee. And I mean, these were the prices that you were paying in the grocery store. So, you know, you can see what the value of a penny was back then. And as I said before, the day-to-day commerce that was going on in St. Genevieve County was, and I'm going to hand these out, if you would. This is what money looked like during the Civil War in St. Genevieve County. The coins, once the Civil War started, was all hoarded. Everybody thought, well, they're going to start printing paper money, and what happens if the Union loses? All that paper money won't be worth. It's just exactly what happened to the Confederate dollars. Okay? Well, what happened? So everybody hoarded coins, and this is what the change looked like, or what the coins looked like during the Civil War. Is on that first page. During the and so what actually ended up happening is you would spend, you know, like a 50-cent piece, which was silver, all of those coins except for the pennies there. And look at some of the denominations. There was no such thing as a nickel. Okay? A nickel was a half dime. And one of the coins there, one of the silver coins, was a half dime. Okay? There was a 1, a 2 cent, and a 3 cent copper coin. But as far as a nickel, there wasn't no nickels. They were half dimes. And then that went on up through the silver, all the way up through the half dollar. And then you have the silver dollar, which, just to give you some idea, silver dollar back then was worth actually 97 cents. Okay? Silver dollar today is worth $33. And I coin collect, so I watch. But silver dollar today is worth $33. Back then, it was worth 97 cents. And that's pure silver. And you look at the gold pieces that's on there, the $5 and the $10 and so forth. That's what those gold pieces was worth. And the $20 gold piece, which is the biggest one on there, was a full ounce of gold. Okay? It was worth $20. An ounce of gold during the Civil War was worth $20. Today, an ounce of gold is worth $1,800.
You know,
Now, when you look at this, all the coins were hoarded. So what were people going to use for barter? Okay? Well, yeah, you had barter where we trade you a chicken for, a pound of flour or whatever. But along with bartering, they also come up with ways of doing such things as they would actually put postage stamps. And remember back then, the postage was either a 1 or a 2-cent stamp during the Civil War. They would actually use stamps, actual stamps, as change. Because there was no change, no metal change to deal with. A lot of the stores would print their own money. They called them shin splints. And they'd actually print their own money. And this was the rate of exchange and stuff. The actual paper money, and most people don't realize this, but the dollar bill, okay, was printed by the U.S. government in 1862. And the reason why it was printed as paper money, legal tender in the United States, was to pay the Union troops. Private get $13 a month. They were called greenbacks, and this is where the name greenbacks comes from, is the backs of those, there's 4 bills that was in the first printing of U.S. dollar bills. And that's you see right there, that's the denominations that it was. But the back side of those, and there's some of them up here, this is what the back side looked like. They were green, printed in green. And that's where the idea of greenbacks come from, was the first issue of the U.S. dollars. And they were issued, and of course the U.S. government said that those dollar bills, if you read them, it says that, after so many years and so forth, this dollar bill can be redeemed for silver. Back then, the rate of exchange was silver. It's not the gold standard that we use today. But the U.S. government said, we're going to print these millions of dollars of paper money to use in the 1860s. And that after so many years that you can redeem this paper money for silver. And that the U.S. government has in our banks, and it wasn't Fort Knox back then, I don't think, but it was in federal banks, that you could redeem that paper money. And of course, that just never happened. It just continued to grow, and the U.S. government just continues to today just to keep printing more paper money. And how much, I don't know, I don't remember what the latest figure is of gold in Fort Knox to back up the U.S. dollar is today. Do you know what it is, Bob? No? But
They won't let me in.
yeah,
There's no gold in Fort
I don't think they even let senators or even presidents in Fort Knox. It's a big guess of how much gold is there to back up the U.S. dollar. But think about this back when it started. I mean, that's where this money and exchange come from. But it just amazes me when you see how far a penny would go, back then, and the taxes and stuff that you paid. Now, even think of it, there's a lot of you in here that's old enough to remember back when I was a kid, in the state of Missouri, they used to have mills, the little red plastic things.
And green.
And green, that was for 5/10 of a cent. But those mills were for 1/10 of a cent. Okay? Back during the Civil War, they had to have change for pennies. When they did revenues, when they went in and buy their revenue stamps and so forth, and it was based on a percentage of your property and so forth, there was no change or sub of a penny. So that's where the whole idea of the mills come from. And, the state of Missouri, God, when I was little, we used to play with mills, the red plastic and the green plastic things. And, well, those originally they weren't plastic. Originally, they were zinc. And there's some copies of those zinc mills that's up here in this book, if you want to look at the original mills were zinc. They weren't plastic, but they were the red ones were for 1/10 of a cent. Now think about that. That they actually had a value in commerce, in trade of 1/10 of a cent actually was a traded value to pay for things. Go figure. Let's see, where are we? Okay, we're back, to Lieutenant Chadwell and so forth. Like I said, his dad, haven't figured out, Gideon, his dad, how he got away with some of the stuff he got. A lot of the Chadwell letters, which when the last Chadwell died, it was a spinster by the name of Maddie Leavenworth, that lived in that big house out there on Chadwell Lane, Jack's house. And my uncle Izzy Dunsey, was the executor of that estate. And it was his job to go in to that house and get the furniture and all of the furnishings and everything in the house ready for an auction. And then all the proceeds would go to the Catholic Church here in St. John. Well, in the upstairs attic of that house was what I refer to as steamer trunks, 7 of them. They were filled with legal and business papers of Alexander's dad, Gideon. And in one of those trunks was a stack of letters. Okay? And the stack of letters was letters that young Alexander had wrote to his sisters and his dad during the Civil War. Izzy, who worked for the post office, Izzy Dunsey, worked for the post office here in St. Genevieve for 56 years. And he was a stamp collector. And on those envelopes were very old issues of stamps. And his sister, my mom, was in the hospital, and him and I were there one night, and he said, "Hey, you still interested in the Civil War?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "What are you doing after visiting ours?" And he said, "Hey, I've got some Civil War letters at home, why don't you come down and look at it?" Well, he was interested just in the envelopes and the stamps that were on the envelopes. And I asked him, I said, "What are these? What's in these envelopes?" And he said, "Well, they're letters from from Alexander to Gideon and his sisters during the Civil War." And I said, "Well, can I read some?" He says, "Yeah, you can have some. He says, "I'll take the expensive envelopes with the expensive stamps on them. And you can have whatever's on the inside. I don't care." And I said, "Well, have you ever read any of these?" And as I said, young Chadwell was very well educated, beautiful handwriting. I had no problem reading it. It was done with a quill pen because every so often would be this big splotch of ink Okay? It was either done with a quill pen or it was done with a pencil. And it was written on, when I was in first grade, we used to get some manila colored paper with lines on it that you used to practice your letters on.
Right.
Well, that's what the letters were, a lot of them were printed on. Anyway, make a long story short, Izzy found this whole bundle of letters. He got the stamps and stuff. I got the letters. And as I said, they read like a history of the Civil War. I mean, one of the letters says, and you got to remember, he was with Forrest. And one of the letters that I've got, it says, "Today we met with Lee." and he was very careful in his letters home to never say where he was at, because he was very conscious of Gustav intercepting, and Gustav did intercept the mail. I mean, he didn't care. That was, forget about Privacy Act and all that we have today. He would intercept and read your mail before it was delivered. He was very careful never to say where he was at. But the real giveaway that, well, I guess even back then, Gustav should have had enough brains to figure it out, but he would say, well, today we engaged the enemy. And he was very eloquent in his writing. And he says, the black Democrats, which were Yankee soldiers or the Union soldiers, he said, the rumors are that they lost about 800 and we lost about the same. And you're going, when he talks losses, he's talking killed. And you're going, man, this is amazing, because there's probably 3 times that many that were wounded. So this was a major battle that they were in, and the guys from St. John, that were in it. So, and the giveaway, he'd never say where it was at, or who was in command, or how the troops moved, or where they were going next, But the giveaway was he'd always date his letters. Well, if you would go to that date on the letter, and he'd say, today we engaged the enemy, or yesterday, you've probably heard about the battle we were in by now, because the letters were always like 2 to 3 weeks behind when they get to St. Genevieve. Anyway, he'd say, well, today, and you look at the date, and then you go back to a timeline of the Civil War, and you figure out, hey, what he was talking about was the Battle of Shiloh that they were in. Yeah, it was a major battle, all right. So, you could figure out by some of these letters what the guys from St. John were in. You got to remember this; these were Confederates now. Okay, we have tracked it that because on the battlefield, if you look at the battlefield maps, the Battle of Vicksburg, there was a lot of Missouri troops, both sides, both Union and Confederate, that was in the Battle of Vicksburg. And you always hear stories about brother against brother and so forth. Well, we have figured out, if you actually look at where the guys from St. Genevieve, the Confederate troops were, and where the Missouri 13th was on the battlefield, they were, and there's no reports of brothers shooting at brothers, or fathers and sons, but there's probably, if you figured it out, there would have been actual cousins that would have been shooting at each other in the Battle of Vicksburg, that they were cousins from St. Genevieve County that were shooting at each other. They didn't know it at the time, who all they knew is that was Union troops or that was Confederate troops they were shooting at. But by battlefield positions of the Battle of Vicksburg, that there very possibly could have been cousins shooting at each other at the Battle of Vicksburg. And the more you get into a lot of things like that, troops from St. Genevieve, of things that happened, it's kind of mind-boggling. But young Chadwell, at the end of the war, he was in the Fort Pillow, as I said, he was in the Fort Pillow massacre. Backing up, as far as military actions are and we talked about the 47th a while ago. The 47th was formed in April of 64, and they were in for 6 months. And they were all mustered in. Well, my grandpa's records say he was mustered in at Fort Benton, which was, Fort Benton was in St. Louis, and that was the Fort Leonard Wood of the Civil War, is where you went for basic training, was at Fort Benton in St. Louis. It's in North St. Louis, and there's a stone out there in North St. Louis where Fort Benton was. But it was like right now, all your Army troops go to Fort Leonard Wood for basic. That's where you went. But their basic amount of 2 weeks. 2 weeks basic instead of what is basic, 6 months. For Army today is probably at least 6 months.
9 weeks.
Is it 9 weeks? Yeah. Okay, I thought it was longer. Anyway, what else we got here? Oh, backing up as far as what actually, the biggest, and I already talked about the EMM, how they were basically, they joined so they wouldn't get drafted. And they were issued, they were actually a regular Army unit that eventually got, and they were furnished weapons and stuff, no uniforms as far as what we can tell. There's very little records that we've been able to find on what the 78th did. But the 78th was made up as a whole regiment, it was like 1,000 guys from St. Genevieve and Perry County. And
They evidently went to taverns because the provost ended up outlawing people selling them booze.
Yeah, one of the orders of the provost marshal was that he banned soldiers from the local bars and banned the local bar owners from selling soldiers. And I think there was some instances of where some of them were actually sent to garrote prison and spent some time in prison for getting liquored up in the bars. And anyway, as far as major events involving troops in St. Genevieve County, probably the most famous one, if you want to say it was famous, was the bank raid. And that goes all the way back to the very beginning of the Civil War. 4 months after the Civil War started, in August 15th, I think it was, of 1861, was the bank raid here in St. Gen. Now, a little bit of background on what was going on. Because of all these Southern secessionists and feelings in St. Gen County, Fremont in St. Louis feared that the money in the local banks, that the Confederate bushwhackers would raid the local banks and take all the money out of local banks. Now, remember, this was gold and silver and banknotes, okay? $58,000 worth of gold, silver, and banknotes that was in the Merchants Bank in St. Genevieve. Now, a lot of people think it's the old rock bank that's down here, and everybody says that's the bank that Jesse James robbed and stuff. The bank that was Merchants Bank looked like this, and it's set down on the corner right across the street from the Show Me Shop, and there's an arbor there now, and it used to be where the St. John Fire Department was, and on that corner was this bank, Merchants Bank, which was a division of Merchants Bank in St. Louis. Okay? Fremont was afraid that the money would go south, and so he sent a division, 250 men and a field piece, a cannon, of Zov Act troops, which were like the Green Berets or the
Special Services.
They were some mean guys. I mean, these were the best troops in the Union Army. Well, all armies from all states had the Zov unit, and the Zovs were the guys that had the uniforms that looked like,
French.
French Foreign Legion, clown uniforms or whatever you want to call them. There was a detachment of them in Cape Girardeau, and Fremont sent, at that time, not young, he was like 30-something years old, Lieutenant Colonel Felix St. James was with the 13th Missouri Rifle Regiment, and he said, because he's from St. Genevieve, we're going to loan him, we're going to take him from the 13th, and we're going to put him with this outfit out of Cape Girardeau. They were stationed at Cape Girardeau, down there at one of the 5 forts in Cape. We're going to send Felix there because he knows St. Genevieve County and everything that goes on in St. Gen. We're going to send him down with the Zove troops and the cannon. We're going to ship him up overnight by riverboat. We're going to surround, on August 15th, we're going to surround the city of St. Genevieve. And early in the morning, we're going to awake Friedland Rozier, who was the bank president. He didn't know this was coming on because he was a Southern sympathizer. We're going to wake him up, and he lived in the Valley House right down across from the visitor center. Okay, the big house right across. That's where he lived, which was at the other end of the block from where the bank was. Okay, wake him up. We're going to take that money out of the bank, that 58,000 something, and we're going to take it on to St. Louis, where it could be guarded by federal troops in the St. Louis Bank. We're going to take it back to Merchants Bank, the mother company in St. Louis. Okay? Well, they did that. They surrounded the town, figured out that there was no Confederate troops around, that the closest Confederate troops at that point were at Pilot Knob in Ironton. And they got him to open the bank. He got really ticked off and said, "You're not taking the," and there was not a riot, I guess you could say, but a lot of protests that went on about taking the people from St. Genevieve, taking their money out of the bank. And it was a Colonel McDonald that was in charge of those Zoves and took the money out of the bank. He took it out of the bank. Rozier said, "You're not taking this money without me." He actually went along with the money. Rumor is he sat on the strong box, and instead of taking it by land, which they thought, well, we could get bushwhacked, and we need all the cannon and the 250 troops. Instead of taking it by land, they put it back on the river by steamboat and took it on to St. Louis on the riverboat. That they didn't do it by land. Well, before McDonald left, John McDonald, before he left St. Genevieve, he could feel the tension and what this was happening in St. Genevieve, and he actually posted, like Martin Luther posted on the cathedral door. He actually posted this proclamation, and if you would hand those out and read the proclamation that he posted to the citizens of St. Genevieve, basically aimed at the Southern sympathizers, and basically saying, if I find out that you have taken any retribution against Union men, I will be back, I shall return, and you will pay the price. You will be punished for picking on any of the Union guys in St. Genevieve. But the money, as far as I can't remember reading anything, Bob, that did the money ever come back to St. Gen?
Yeah.
It did.
Yes.
And of course, not only was there, Confederate sympathizers' money in that bank, but a lot of the local Union people, the Germans that were in St. Gen County, their money, and I didn't ever remember reading anything to where that bank, that 58,000 was ever returned.
Yes.
Now, some of that, I'm sure, was actually invested by Merchants Bank of St. Louis. That some of that 58,000 was probably seed money that was here in St. Genevieve. But
Actually, the raid got reported in the New York Times.
Oh, yeah?
in 1861.
Okay.
So that could have been a lot of the only money and a lot of farmers had was right there.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
had to go
but
to St. Louis to get it.
keep in mind, 1861, there was no paper money. It was all either banknotes or it was gold and silver. You know, is what they took on to St. Louis, that 58,000. Okay, that was probably the major event, was that. Along with that, there was the taking of the courthouse, which actually took place in October of 1864, and they were there until July of 1865, where the Union troops, at the request, I guess, of Gustav, we're gonna take over the courthouse, and you're gonna live in the courtroom for, well, a year. Yeah. You know, that they occupied the courthouse right across the street here. And at the end of the war, there's a whole scenario and a whole lot of paperwork of where the county tried to file, and it actually went, I think, to the U.S. Supreme Court, where there was action on the county of St. Genevieve against the federal government for damages and for rent, or for what happened to the courthouse for those Union troops that were here during the Civil War. And I think the original asking thing was for like $3,000, and after, God, what, 50 years or something?
41 years.
41 years later, the federal government actually paid, instead of the $3,000, I think it was like $1,200. $1,200 is what the federal government finally paid the county of St. Genevieve, after it went through all kinds of court cases and everything else, actually paid them for screwing up the courthouse. And after how many years, Tom?
41.
41 years later, the county actually got paid for the use of the courthouse.
Hell of a return on their investment.
They probably weren't paying any interest, that's for sure. That's basically the big things as far as troops involvement, or, you know, that happened in St. Genevieve. And as I said, the 78th. The war ends, of course, in 1865. At the very end of the war, and this kind of has something to do with troops, in 1865, right at the January, I think it was, of 1865, right before the end of the war, like 4 months later, there was so much animosity, and the war was tapered down. You know, the different generals and battles were all being won by the Union. The South saw, you know, what was going to happen, and there was so much animosity in St. Genevieve County, as well as in other places in St. Genevieve, or in Missouri, that there was actually a militia that was actually formed, and it was called Flood's Militia. And it was originally supposed to be a full company, 100 guys, from St. Genevieve County. That would be very similar to what, the 78th was already gone. They were already mustered out, didn't exist at the end of the war. The Flood's Militia was supposed to be 100 guys from St. Genevieve County that were formed to protect Union interest and Union people in St. Genevieve County from oppression after the Civil War. Now, remember, all the way till the end of the Civil War, it was still military rule. It was still, they were under martial law. And in fact, at the end of the Civil War, one of the guys that was in Chadwell's company, Pratt, I think his name was John Pratt, okay, he came back immediately after the armistice was signed, at least signed it in Appomattox. He came back like within the next month, back to St. Genevieve. St. Genevieve was still under martial law. Our friend Gustav, okay, the provost marshal, had him tried, since he was with young Chadwell and was with Forrest Group, had him tried under military court for war crimes. They took him out and hung him. And the war was over. But there was still civil unrest in Missouri. Flood's military was formed to protect and to make sure things like that didn't happen. Well, Flood's unit, I don't think they were in existence for 6 months in 1865, but it was from guys that had already been mustered out, a lot of them. They had been mustered out from the 47th and from the 78th, that they were still around, and they were brought back in as Flood's militia in 1865.
Wait, Tom, who was that was hung?
His name was Charles Pratt, Pratte. When he come home, he was tried by the provost marshal under it was still they were still under martial law in St. Genevieve County.
What had he supposedly done?
He was with Forrest, and he was a Confederate soldier.
Just being a Confederate soldier?
He was by just belonging. I mean, he didn't. It wasn't for any specific war crimes.
How about Chadwell? Did he get back?
Chadwell did not come back to St. Genevieve County. One of his sisters, actually, in one of the Chadwell letters, they wrote to him and told him, "Don't come back." At the end of the war, he ended up in Memphis as a college professor, I think, in a girls' college, and taught down there. Did not come back to St. Genevieve County for 7 years after the Civil War was over. And he came back because his father, Gideon, was dying and was ill. He came back to St. Genevieve after like 7 years, and eventually ended up running for a political office, ended up as the county surveyor in St. Genevieve. He was one of the directors or the founders, I don't know what they call them, in the Presbyterian church here. The director or like the board of directors. He was one of the elders. He was one of the elders of the Presbyterian church here in town, and actually founded the first Presbyterian church here in St. Genevieve, and went on to be, as I said, the county surveyor and a lawyer in St. Genevieve County. He's buried outside the wall. He gave up his Catholic faith, and it's real funny. The rest of his family, the Chadwells and the Leavenworths, are all buried on the west side of the brick wall down through Valley Spring Cemetery. But Chadwell and his wife and family, they're the first graves that are buried below the wall in St. Genevieve in Valley Spring Cemetery.
So the provost marshal didn't bother his family then?
No, and see, that was
sister.
one of the weird things about his sister. Ended up teaching school. Says he's a Southern sympathizer, and he's got a son in the Confederate Army. But Gustav never did anything to Gideon. Never did anything with his property or
Didn't
anything.
bother the Rosiers in the bank then either.
No. Well, I think he realized the power of association in St. Jim, and that he could wake up with his house burned down some night or something. That
Did you say he was killed?
who?
The provost marshal.
No. He lived. I think he lived forever. I don't. He was well into the 1912 or 1920s that he died. I mean,
His house was up on the end of like Maple Lane or past the school. It was called a haunted house.
Yeah, some of you probably remember that up on.
I remember that.
What was that street called? When I was growing up, it was a haunted house up there.
Virginia.
Was it Virginia? Yeah, it's up around Virginia, but it was right there on the corner, like just west of where those apartment houses were built quite a while ago. It was on the end of that street, And, well, is it the Lutheran cemetery
Yeah.
that's up there?
That was a brick house, and people would go up there and steal bricks out of it to add to their fireplaces. So
That was it.
So Tom, did many of the Confederate soldiers come back? Are they afraid to come back?
A lot of them stayed away, never did come back. A lot of them did, but it was like young Chadwell. It was like 7, 10 years
And when
later.
did the martial law?
I don't know, Bob. Do you know when martial law was actually ended in St. John
No,
County?
no.
You know,
And then they could come back.
It's still in.
it's still in place.
It's still in place, so.
That's just because you're on the list.
So, at this point, just a little bit about some of the stuff I brought along tonight. As I said, there's copies of the money, revenue stamps, some of the books that were published, pictures of young Chadwell and Gideon. We've never been able to find a picture of what Felix St. James, what he, Lieutenant Colonel, and his appointment as a Lieutenant Colonel. Never been able to figure out how he immediately rose to Lieutenant Colonel.
He
But it was-
he
it was-
mustered in the 13th
it was political.
as lieutenant colonel.
Yeah.
Right at the time you could buy a commission.
It's kind of amazing though that
Yeah.
Felix and August's father was a slave owner.
Yeah.
Felix St. James' father-in-law was a slave owner. You can imagine the conversation around the family dinners. Must have been something else.
Yeah.
There was a conversation.
There was a lot of the northern fanatic Union people that were slave owners, yeah. Well, figure it out. 617 slaves in St. Genevieve County in 1860, yeah.
Tom and Heather, I know some of the southern free blacks
Yeah.
were also slave owners. Over
Yes.
50% of them were.
Yes.
Yeah.
How did they become a freed slave? Or,
Bob?
It goes way back to
Yeah.
even during the French colonial period.
Yeah.
We identified quite a few before the Americans took over that would be free blacks.
Yeah.
Under the Spanish laws after 1763 to 1800, they could purchase their own freedom. They could
Yeah.
work and garden and sell things and purchase their freedom. But a number of them did. And so we have those records from the
Yeah.
Catholic Church.
Another on that same course, there would be, when you were a freed slave, where'd you go? You know, who was going to hire you?
You went north, yeah.
Yeah, you had to leave.
Yeah.
It's kind of like the Southeast Missouri riots they had
Yeah.
down there when they all camped out. What was that, in the 30s, I think?
Well,
Probably
the-
61.
The riots in St. Genevieve
Yeah.
in 1939, I think was the race riots in St. Genevieve.
Yeah.
When?
1930.
1930. I was thinking 39, yeah.
But also with that price, when he came up from, through Springfield and was going to take on the, what's the name of that area over there, the battle?
Carthage?
Well,
Oh, Pilot Knob, yeah.
he was so big that he couldn't ride a horse. He had to ride in the buggy.
Yeah.
He was of that large a person.
Well, he had 10,000 troops.
Yeah.
Most of them didn't have any shoes or didn't have any weapons.
Yeah, because my great-grandfather was on the way up here to go to that battle. And, you know, at that time, 20 miles a day walking or 25 with a horse.
Yeah.
So that took from southeast Missouri to get there. The time they got there, you know, they had retreated and pushed and shoved, and Price was on his way up to Sedalia then.
There's a couple of good maps that I put out here on battles and stuff in southeast Missouri. One that the regional planning put out here on Civil War in southeast Missouri. There is some brochures here on Civil War that the state tourism people put out, which is pretty good about where the Civil War started. Back here, weapons-wise, I didn't bring many with me tonight. I brought the actual 2 rifles. One was the regular Confederate issue, which was the British Enfield rifle, if you were issued weapons by the Confederate Army. The other one was the Springfield, 1861 Springfield, which was the regular issue to Union forces. It was the most accurate, easiest to maintain rifle of the Civil War. It kind of revolutionized military warfare. There was 700,000 of them produced for Union forces during the Civil War. A little bit about the ammo, paper ladies and so forth. How it all works with your paper cartridges, or what's referred to as paper ladies, which was the actual charge. What a mini bullet looked like. It's all in there. A little bit about rations. If you were fully equipped for a forced march or to go into battle, this is what you would have in your haversack. Okay? This is what a soldier of the 47th Missouri Infantry looked like as he went in fully equipped with the canteen, the haversack. The haversack is what they kept their food in. And if you look at what was issued by the quartermaster, this was how many pounds of flour or how many pounds of salt that they were issued, and they would carry in their haversack, as well as some sow belly, which was bacon or just grease. And then the K rations of the Civil War, hardtack. And you've read and heard a lot about hardtack, and I baked these, I guess it was in April. But a lot of the hardtack that was ate or tried to eat during the Civil War could have been baked a year or so before it was actually softened up and consumed, but it's salt and water.
You have to soak it up good.
Well, and it would kill the weevils that was in it, the bugs. Of course, that was good protein, and you'd eat the weevils too because it was good protein. But hardtack, yeah, hardtack, and there was.
Well, did you dip it in salt water or something?
Well, you do a couple different things.
Why'd they have so much
One of
salt?
the things that you do is you take your boiling coffee and your issued tin cup, and you take a cup of hot coffee and you put your hardtack in your coffee, and that would do two things. It would soften it, and it would also kill the weevils. They'd float to the top. But yeah, you could talk all night about how Civil War soldiers were fed and
So you baked that in April and you got weevils in it.
not yet. No, I keep them in a plastic bag. But I mean, back then there was no Reynolds wrap. There was no baggies. You know, I mean, they were put in a wooden box. You know, and you were lucky if maybe they had paper lining the box. But yeah, some of them boxes would stay sealed and be transported into the field, and it may take a year or so before the box was ever opened. Yeah. Yep. But as I said, this is what a Union soldier in the 47th would look like, and of course the leather accoutrement. Some of it I have on, you know, and the ammo box and the cap box and so forth. And then over here, this what looks like a whole case of junk, okay, is in the backpack that you see on those guys. In the backpack, okay, what was in that backpack? Well, there was some things that were issued, like 40 rounds of paper ladies, a box of caps, which actually set off the charge, a housewife. You had a housewife in your pack. That was a sewing kit. They called it a housewife. But housewife, candles. Candles were issued by the quartermaster. Keep in mind, there were no flashlights. So at night, if you were able to build a fire, your light was the fire or candles. So one of the big things that was issued right along with your food was so many candles each time you got rations. Such things as soap, tooth powder. There's no toothpaste. There's tooth powder. Well, what tooth powder actually is baking soda. And some people still use baking soda to brush their teeth. But tooth powder, Bible, shaving equipment, comb, mirror, writing envelopes and stamps and so forth to write with. Those were all things that would go in the backpack, as well as an extra set of long johns, which, believe me, these wool pants I got long johns on. I couldn't stand these wool pants if I didn't have something on under them. So you had long johns, extra pair of socks, half of a pup tent. Okay? And this is interesting because you'd carry half of a pup tent in your backpack, and you'd couple up with another one of the infantry and button them together, and then the two of you would stay in that tent overnight, the two soldiers or infantry. But you carried half of a pup tent in your backpack. And a ground cloth, which is interesting because, believe it or not, during the Civil War, they had a rubber coating. And they actually took canvas and actually painted canvas with this rubberized paint, and it would actually make it waterproof.
Wax.
They would use this as a ground cloth in their tent, but it also, in the middle of it, it's got a big hole, and it would also fit over your head, and they'd use this as a poncho. Okay, so that was in your backpack, as well as extra socks and so forth. But that was all in your backpack. And as I said, as you go into battle, if you were completely equipped by the quartermaster, and if you were lucky enough to get all these things for food, you'd usually be issued beans and flour and salt. The premium stuff, if the quartermaster was able to get it, was coffee and sugar. Those were the other things. And this tells
the flour and the salt. Would you bake your bread or something?
well,
Make gravy.
Make it.
along with those things to actually supplement, you'd kill on the run. You'd kill squirrels and rabbits and whatever you could. You'd forage. But when all else fails, you would eat the Civil War K rations or hardtack. You're welcome to look at any. I'll stick around and answer questions. What's that? That is what's referred to as a battle rattle. Started out in the Catholic Church as a church instrument that would be used on Holy Thursday night. And from Holy Thursday night to Easter morning, there was no bells that would be rung in the Catholic Church because bells were thought of as glorious and celebrate and so forth, where the clitoris was actually a kind of a dull or a deadening sound, which was kind of death and so forth. Now, this was one version of it, and if you look in your animal dictionaries and stuff, under rattlesnake, the Latin name or Greek name for rattlesnake is the same as this.
What was that
In the Civil War, it started out as being an alarm on Civil War ships to all hands on deck. But then it started in the camps, in infantry, in the tents, because there was so many different bugle calls that they would use a bugler for. They were afraid that a far bugle call could be confused with reveille or something else, a call to arms or whatever. So they ended up with the rattle, and they would run through the camp, the sentry on guard. If there was a fire, some tent or something was on fire, he'd run through the camp with this, and there was no mistake what this was for. So you'd grab your bucket, your canvas bucket, fill it with water, and run towards the fire. Okay? Now, later on, in the Confederate Army, with their famous rebel yell, they ended up using these as a battle rattle. And that's where it gets its name, as a battle rattle. That, picture this, about a dozen of these running across a field at you with their bayonets and shooting at you, rattling these things, okay, and running at you. It would sound like a freight train's coming at you. So it was a psychological thing, and it was referred to as a battle rattle.
I've seen those in some old estates, and they call them,
Well,
for
there's another version.
Wedding chivalries.
Yeah, well, there was another version of this that was used after this in the Catholic Church, and it was called a clapper. And it was a board with a hammer, a hinged hammer on it, and you would do this, and that hammer would go back and forth and go clack, 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 and that was used on Easter services. When I was an altar boy, and we'd always have these big processions, and the high school altar boys would walk in the procession, and there was 2 of them that would have what was referred to as a clacker, but it was the same, a different version of this. Yeah.
The city council banned those things along with what they call sherry berries, which is the French for chivalries.
Yeah.
And Guillaume, which is the guys that run the Guillaume, they banned all of them at one time because and then there was a big court case about 5 years later when the guys decided they were going to run the Guillaume, and John Scott got them off, and they went to a tavern.
One of the interesting pieces that I just discovered just a few years ago in doing Civil War reenactments and so forth is in this case here is what's called a strata, and it's actually the Civil War version of a rangefinder. Today, when you go deer hunting, you got all this electronics and you look in the scope and it says, well, that deer's out there at 800 yards. This was a handheld rangefinder that was used by sharpshooters in the Civil War, okay? And the brass ones, which this is a brass one, the brass one was issued for the sharpshooter or the best shot in a company of soldiers. That's 100 guys. He would be issued a brass one because he was the best shot in the company. And this rangefinder, he was a sniper, or a sharpshooter. In the whole regiment, which was 800 to 1,000 soldiers in a regiment, the best shot, or the sharpshooter in the regiment, would be issued a sterling silver strata, because he was the best shot. And it was kind of a badge of, and you notice it's got a chain and a thing to where they could put them in their buttonholes. But they're very accurate. I made this one off of some original plates, and at 800 yards, it's within a yard or 2 of being accurate. I mean, just holding it up, it's really got to do with how good the eyesight of the sharpshooter is. If you've got bad eyesight like I do, but it's a mathematical equation of that angle and moving that chart over and then looking at it based on the height of the normal Civil War infantry soldier was 5'10", believe it or not, and one side of the strata is for infantry attacks or gauging a field range on infantry. The other side is gauging cavalry, and that was figured at 8 foot. That the height of the horse to the top of the guy riding is 8 foot, and if you dial it in and move that slide over and get them in there, it's real accurate as far as. And I've actually measured out. You got to calibrate it first, and I calibrated it, laid out like a football field, and so many feet with a measuring. But it's really accurate. But it's a rangefinder that was used by sharpshooters. So you're welcome to ask anything or look at anything. There's different samples of old coinage, old bills, revenue stamps, beautiful stamps. Revenue stamps were, like I said, there's playing cards, wills. They had a revenue stamp for everything.
And before you leave, down in the gift shop, we had these available for sale.
Yep.
And it's friend or foe alike, a tour guide to Missouri's Civil War. And it's very interesting because it's got a map to every city in Missouri where there was a skirmish. and it gives you the information about it and when it took place and who was involved with it. It's got the information on the Missouri Fox. Is it the Missouri Fox or the
Swamp Fox.
Swamp Fox? There you go, Swamp Fox. Great stories in here. They're available in the gift shop. Ellie has them down here on your way out if anybody's interested. Again, we want to thank
Tell them
you.
the author's last name.
Wulik.
Greg Wall.
WLK.
Greg Wolk.
Yeah.
Yeah, happens to be a cousin of mine that I didn't know that I had until we started working on the wall downstairs, the generation wall. And he called me and said, "Hey, cuz." I haven't got no cuz. Turns out he was my cousin. So, thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate it. And we want to thank again our sponsor for this evening, which is the Dew Drop-In
Cozy Kitchen.
and Cozy Kitchen. They sponsored this. We thank them very much. Thank you folks for attending, and Tom will be around for any questions.
Any of you that's got family that goes way back, check up there because it's your great-grandpa or your great-great-grandpa's up there on the list.
Tom's right. We were down at Vicksburg, and there's a guy from St. Genevieve that's buried down there, George Paul. And it was Tom, I, and a guy who's descended from the Lurks here. We're all related to this guy.
Yeah.
My great-great-uncle and Tom's great-uncle, and so
All
you never know
related.
at St. Genevieve.
Union soldier is buried in Vicksburg, yeah.
One more thing about your list here, I'm not originally from here, and my dad told me about great-grandfather heading toward the Pilot Knob thing, that I attended one of your meetings, I don't know how many
Well,
years.
he was with Price if he was heading towards it.
Well, but anyway, he was, when the time he got there, the battle was over, like I say, retreat, push and shove there. But at that night with Gary, he says, well, we can check that out. And I gave him the name. He came back 2 minutes later with 2 pages of information
Hey,
on my great-grandfather that I never knew existed.
we got guys like Bob and Gary Shell,
Yeah.
who I think Gary's on his 3rd book on Civil War.
I think he's on his 4th.
4th book now, okay, that he's written on the 13th, which was the retreating Union forces from Pilot Knob that went up through Leesburg and Cuba and on up through there. Price was chasing him. But yeah, if you've got a name, and if you're not, your family's not originally from St. Genevieve, there are, I think in the state of Missouri, is there 14 or 15 camps like ours, Bob, that are sons of Union veterans? And if you contact one of them, that would be like in St. Louis or Jeff City or Kansas City, they can run tracers on your ancestors too. I mean, that's
This one
what we do.
came through the Missouri Historic somewhere.
Yeah.
But he ran on the computer.
So the Secretary of State has a military service thing for
Yeah.
the Civil War. I think Gary uses something called Fold 3, which is really the thing to go look at documents for an individual soldier.
Yeah. We've compiled on, I don't know how many have we got the actual pro forms on. You can pick out a name, and we've got a full sheet on some of these guys. I don't know, maybe 100 of them. That we've got the whole genealogy of what they did and where they lived and who some of the relatives are today in St. Genevieve County. Stolzer is one that stands out. Of course, it's Gary Stolzer, our sheriff. It's one of his ancestors and so forth. But
We also want to know where the people are buried.
Yes.
And you'll see on the list that on our big list that we have that, and that we mark them on Find a Grave also with a memorial, and try to put what unit they were in and that sort of thing.
there's so much online now that you can get, like war records and everything. It's like I said, I applied, man, it's been 30, 35 years ago that I applied for my great-grandpa Christian's war records, and I ended up getting his muster-in papers which actually gave a description of what he looked like. He was a little guy, a lot littler than I am, but and then it gave his pay vouchers that showed, each month his pay voucher that he got his $13 a month, and then his muster out papers when he actually got out at Benton, at Fort Benton, and it goes on how much he owed the government for something that was issued him that he actually had to pay for. Officers had to pay for their uniforms, their arms, their swords, the whole works.
What did they get paid in a month?
Pardon?
How much month did they get paid?
I don't know. I don't know what officers got paid. It varied depending on what your rank was. But pensions, after the Civil War, then you can apply for your pension papers on your Civil War history people, and it'll tell you who got it and so forth. Interesting enough, when I was looking not too long ago, the last and children of Civil War soldiers could be paid their pension years later. The last child of a Civil War soldier, okay, Irene, I want to say Watts, but I don't think it's Watts. Anyway, her first name was Irene. She died in 2018. She was receiving $73 a month from the U.S. War Department up till when she died in 2018. She was the last person receiving a Civil War pension. But it was in 2018. It was like 4 years ago.
Thank you very much.